Okay, so now that we have our normal map baked for our prop piece here, we are going to look at how to bake the ambient occlusion map. Now, we've baked an ambient occlusion before in our tile set series, but we're going to look at how to do the ambient occlusion for a prop such as this one. It's not going to be too radically different, but there are some things you need to keep in mind when dealing with a manifold object such as this one. So the first thing you'll notice when you go to bake your ambient occlusion is that when you try to come in here to bake type, you'll see that we only have normals and displacement here. We don't have an option for ambient occlusion. Now, this is because we are using the bake from multi-res. This is simply just a limitation of Blender. You cannot use a multi-res modifier to bake ambient occlusion from your object basically to a lower resolution version of it. So we need to uncheck this, and that will give us all of our bake types back here, including ambient occlusion. But now the issue is, how do we bake from basically a high subdivision here to a low subdivision on the same mesh? Well, the short answer is simply that we really can't. So what we need to do here is to duplicate this object and then use the selected to active option that we used when we were talking about creating our tiling texture. So I'm going to pop into the layout tab just to get a little bit easier of a view here. And the first thing I'm going to do is just duplicate this object by hitting Shift and D on the keyboard. Okay, so I got, sort of a lag and a hitch there, because keep in mind that this object here has this 6 layers of subdivision, so it has, 3,000, or it has 6,000 triangles now between these two objects, or 6 million, I should say. So it just takes a little bit of time to calculate that because it is such a high resolution object. I'm going to clear the location of this by selecting it and hitting Alt and G on the keyboard to snap it back to where it was. And I'm going to do the same thing for this one so that they are occupying the same physical space. Because if you remember, when we retopologized this, we placed the origin point up at the brow here, but we didn't move it at all. So we need these two pieces to be occupying the same physical space in order for this bake to work. So let's just hit Alt-NG on this one. It doesn't fully matter right now where the pivot point is. We're going to have to move it anyway before we bring it into Unreal. It's just important that they match. Okay, so we need to decide which one is going to be our low res and which one is going to be our high res version. Now, this is my original object here. I am going to make this one my low poly because 1, it is already set to that. And 2, we already have our material in our bake applied to this object. So I'm just going to leave this one as it is. Actually, the only thing I'm going to do here is to speed up my performance. I'm going to just delete this multi-res modifier from just this one. It's important that you keep it on this one though. Okay. Let's hide the original and let's look at our high poly here. For this one, all I'm going to do is apply my multi-res. So basically, I'm going to keep it at its highest level of subdivision, but I'm going to delete those that are lower. I'm going to do that by applying this. So I'm just going to, in object mode, of course, hit this drop down and click apply. And because this is a very dense object, it may take several minutes to calculate this. Okay, so once that is applied, it will disappear from the modifier stack, and what you will be left with is 2 duplicates of your model directly on top of each other. One will be your low poly and one will be your high poly. So I'm just going to rename this one so I don't confuse myself, just to keep these straight. Okay, so now that we have this duplicated out properly, we can use this selected to active output. Of course, we need a texture slot to bake into. So let's come into our material, Shift A, and add an image texture. And we are going to be creating a new one here. Let's call this AO for ambient occlusion. I'm going to leave it at a 4K resolution. I'm going to disable the alpha because we don't need it. And I'm going to leave the generated type as blank. So let's hit OK. And we can see a preview of this on the left side if we select it from the dropdown, and it is, of course, just a blank black image. So for ambient occlusion, I'm just going to make sure that this is set to 1 for full brightness. And the one thing that's most important I found when baking ambient occlusion here is that if you have any other objects in your scene, such as these backups I've created, 1 for my stage 1 of sculpting and 2 for my retopology, these, even if they are hidden, they will affect the outcome of your ambient occlusion. So because I have all of these here, they're basically, even though I can't see them in the viewport, they are still going to be blocking light, and that is going to negatively affect our outcome here. So it is really important that if you have anything like this, like backups or any hidden objects that you do not want to be part of your bake, we need to not only disable them from the viewport, but we also need to hit this camera icon right here to disable them from any renders or bakes that we do. Okay, so probably don't need 16 pixels of margin, but let's go ahead and select our high poly and then control and select our low poly in the outliner. And let's just see what kind of result we get from this bake here. We will probably need to make some adjustments, but that is okay. So uncheck bake from multi-res, make sure selected to active is checked, and make sure your selection order is correct. So select the high resolution one first and then the low. And then go ahead and click bake. Okay, I went ahead and paused the recording because I forgot to set my max samples back down to a low value for testing bakes. But let's go ahead and look at what we have here. Obviously, this looks to be quite a mess because we need to make some adjustments here in order to get our bake to work properly. So what we really need to do here, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set these samples back down to 1. Just to speed up the bake process until I get my settings correct, and then I will up-res it back again to get the final result here. So it's a little difficult to parse what is going on here, but basically it is the same issue we were having with our tile set, in that every area of our sculpt that was poking through our low-res version here was causing some issues here. So what I'm going to do, just to make this cleaner, is I'm going to disconnect my normal map for a moment in order to better visualize the areas that are poking through. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use some of these extrusion and max ray distance settings to refine this further. So when we baked our tile set, we were baking a flat image from a flat plane. So all we had to do to avoid this was to just raise our plane up a little bit up away from our sculpt so that the sculpt wasn't poking through. Now, this is a closed, otherwise known as a manifold object. So there's no direction that we can move this such that it won't cause issues on the other side. So to mitigate this like poking through effect, all we have to do is use some of these options here. So the extrusion option is basically describing that process of moving the low poly away from the high poly so that it no longer is clipping through. So it's basically going to inflate our low poly object by whatever number we set here. Currently it's 0 meters, so it's not inflating it at all. Now the max ray distance has to do with how these maps are calculated. Basically what is happening is that it looks at your objects and it's going to take your low poly object and it's going to shoot a ray or a vector out from it or in from it at a certain distance, and whenever it hits something else, meaning the high poly sculpt here, it's going to use whatever information is under it to bake to that texture. So with that in mind, let's start messing with these settings a little bit to try to get a better result. So I'm going to start pretty small here. I'm going to hit the extrusion of 0.1 meters and a max ray distance of 0.1 meters. So let's make sure our selection order is correct, and let's hit bake again. And this should go a little bit faster this time because, again, I have reduced my samples here. Okay, so here is the result of my second bake. Now, these little tiny black dots are nothing to worry about. That is just because I reduced my samples here, so I'm getting a much lower quality image. These will go away when you increase this value up again. It's these large black areas that are the issue here. So anywhere that you're seeing these big splotches, this is because the mesh of the sculpt is still poking through at that area. So we need to increase these values here in order to get the extrusion large enough such that the mesh won't poke through. Now you'll notice when I change these settings, nothing changes in the viewport. That is because this is not actually scaling your mesh in any way. So you will not be able to visualize these changes in any way other than, increasing these values and baking again to see the difference. So unfortunately, there's no way to, in real time, view this based on using these settings, but it's just a little bit of trial and error. So again, I'm ignoring these tiny black dots. It's these big splotches that I'm trying to get rid of. So I'm going to make my selection again, make sure everything is selected properly. I've made my changes. Let's hit bake one more time. And the ambient occlusion maps do take a little bit longer to bake than the normals. That's normal, so I'm just going to pause the recording while it's baking. Okay, so we have our third result here. This is looking pretty good. We do still have one little issue here with the lips. So let's increase this to 0.3 and 0.3 and try one more time. Okay, so that last bake took just a minute or two, and you'll see that if we look at our image here, we still have these fuzzy black dots that are just a sampling issue, but all of the large black splotches that were caused by the mesh clipping have gone away. So for my particular case, 0.3 and 0.3 seem to work very well. This may vary for you because your object and your sculpt obviously will be slightly different than mine. So it's really just a matter of trial and error with these. So I'm going to do my full resolution bake and then we'll come back with the final image here. So I'm just going to set my samples back up to 4K and hit bake. Okay, so it only took 3 or 4 minutes, but this is the final result with the full resolution ambient occlusion bake. You see we got nice soft shadows in here, and we're getting some of the detail from the stone surface damage is what these little black splotches are. So that is going to wrap it up for that. Let's just take a quick look at how this looks on our model before we stop the recording. So I'm just going to hide the high resolution so it's not poking through. I'm going to reconnect my normal map here. And I'm going to connect my ambient occlusion to the color here. Looks like I forgot to save my normal map, of course, so it's throwing some errors. Let's come into our ambient occlusion and make sure that we save this. Wherever you like on your desktop. Let's call this T for texture and AO for ambient occlusion. And I'm just going to rebake this normal really quick because I forgot to save it, of course. So let's change this back to multi-res. Actually, we can no longer change this, use the multi-res here because of course I applied and deleted them. So that is my bad for not saving the image, but we can still bake our normal map using these, using the low and the high poly we have set up. We're just going to uncheck this. We're going to change the bake type back to normal. And we should still retain these extrusion and max ray distance settings here. So let's just make sure our selection order is correct. We have the correct texture selected in our material here. So we don't want to bake over this one essentially. Let's just hit bake. Okay, so here is the result of my sort of last minute fixing bake. I believe my multi-res bake did not produce this background image. If you see, or color, I should say, if you see this, don't worry about it. This color right here is simply to denote like a blank value for a normal map. So this is perfectly normal. This is a great normal map. So let's save it so we don't forget. And once that's saved, now let's connect these and look at the final result here. Okay, so this is our low poly results with our map bakes. So we're gonna pause right here, and when we come back, we are going to finish this model by painting some textures on it. All right, now that we have all of our maps baked out onto our low poly version of our model here, we are ready to start painting in our textures. So for this, it is pretty much going to be the same process as we did for the tiling textures. So let's go ahead and look at that. So I'm just gonna tab over here into the texture paint mode right here. I'm just going to set up my viewport a little bit here. Now, if you like to see the normal textures in isolation, or the AO or any of your textures in isolation, you can definitely do that. I like to see the final result. I think it just gives me a better indication of what I'm doing. So rather than be in solid shading mode with the individual maps, I'm just going to switch back to my material shading, which will show me my normal as a normal map. And currently my ambient occlusion is plugged into my color at the moment. So let's create a new texture slot to paint our base color into. So I am going to split my screen right here just by dragging up from the corner when I have the crosshairs. I'm going to change this from paint to view, because in this window I just want to pull up my reference image again. If you want to get rid of the UVs, we can just disable our overlays here. It was just laying out our UVs according to the resolution of this image. So again, I'm going to use this both for reference and for color sampling, just like we did in the tile set section. I'm also going to disable this grid here. It's just sort of bothering me and in my way. So to disable the grid here, all I'm going to do is come up to my overlays. Disabling floor here will get rid of the lines, and then to get rid of these axes lines, all you have to do is disable them right here and right here. And then of course to get them back, you just enable them again. Okay, so let's start. I'm going to start by sampling a color first. Actually, no, I'm going to start by creating my base color. So I'm just going to come up here, press plus, base color. That's fine. Whatever name you want to give it is fine. I'm going to give it a 4K resolution. And for the color, you can leave it white, or if you want to sample it directly, actually, you're not able to sample directly. The eyedropper is gone. So let's just leave it white and press OK. If you want to preview it, we can change this section up here to base color. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start sampling colors. Actually, before I do that, let's look at our shading here. So Because our ambient occlusion was plugged into the base color, our base color image that it created had nowhere to go. So let's just make sure that this is set up correctly. Otherwise, it will not display on your model correctly while you're painting, and that would be confusing. So I'm going to apply the ambient occlusion to the base color the same way I did before, using a mix RGB node. So I'm just hitting Shift A to bring up the add menu, into color, mix RGB. Let's drop that in between. I'm going to put base color into color 1, the ambient occlusion into color 2, and the output into my base color output. And I'm going to change this mix mode from mix to multiply. And I'm going to change the factor to 1 to give it the full effect of the ambient occlusion here. Now, if you put the ambient occlusion in color 1 and the base color in color 2, you are going to get different results because of the factor here. So just keep that in mind. They will be slightly different. So because of this, I want the ambient occlusion in 2 and the color in 1. Okay, let's return to the texture paint tab. And we are just going to start painting. I'm going to create a new palette just like I did before. Oops. I'm just going to delete that. I accidentally added white to my palette instead of first selecting my color. So I'm going to click my color and I'm going to select. I'm going to try to select something sort of in the mid-range here. Nothing too highlighted, nothing too in shadow as my basis. So it's this sort of, beige-ish brown. We can add it to our palette, and now I'm just going to take my pen tablet and just gonna give this an overall layer of paint. And now you'll see when I'm not painting on a flat surface, you can see how the angle of my camera is affecting my paint strokes here, because these areas were not visible to my camera. When I went in and painted over them, they sort of were excluded from my stroke, but that's okay because I'm just going to go over this whole thing from every angle and just give it a solid base color here. Keep in mind that the more you try to paint in one stroke, the slower Blender is going to be. So if you're trying to paint the whole thing like I am and you're getting lags, it may be worth it to just use a smaller brush size. Okay, so that looks pretty good to me. Okay. Actually, I have made a mistake here. I have accidentally painted over my ambient occlusion instead of my base color because I had it selected here. So I'm going to fix this by reloading my image because I haven't saved any of these changes. So let's just go to image and reload, and that will return my ambient occlusion to white. Make sure you have base color selected here. Otherwise, you'll get some problems. And I'm just going to do that again. And then, as I was talking about earlier in the UV section, sometimes you do notice these seams here, especially when you zoom out. They become more noticeable than when you zoom in. This is because of a phenomenon known as MIP mapping, which, without getting into too much detail, it basically just de-reses your image as you zoom out to save for performance, but it does cause problems such as showing our seams. So how to fix this? Well, essentially, this is being caused by pixel bleed, which I also discussed when we talked about UV maps and baking. So what is happening is when I zoom out, it's using basically larger and larger pixels, and part of those are white, and they're bleeding over onto this, onto our actual map here. So to fix this, we just need to make the areas outside of our actual UVs the same color as our base color. So I'm just going to come in, and you can do it to the whole thing, but you really just need to come around the edges here and add a little bit of padding with the color. And you can see that, like, if you watch these seams in real time, you can see them going away as I paint this. So as long as there's some, a few pixels of the color that you want for your base color, those seams should go away when you zoom out. Okay. I'm just gonna fill this in because it looks messy and it bothers me, but you don't have to do this. Okay. All right, so there is our base layer. Let's go over with a layer of shadow. So I'm going to come to my color select. I'm going to sample, I don't want to sample the darkest shadows here, but I do want to sample an area that is slightly darker than my base. So like that looks pretty good to me. Let's save the color. Okay. Here is where it gets a little bit more artistic. Keeping in mind the rules that we sort of talked about when we did this for our last section. Any areas that are pushed in, I want to paint as darker, and any areas that are coming out, I want to highlight as lighter. So I'm going to reduce the strength of my brush here so I get a more natural look. And I'm just going to come in and start painting in on these crevices. So keep in mind that your brush size is going to stay static relative to your screen, regardless of your level of zoom. So if I zoom way out, these strokes are going to be much larger. So just something to keep in mind as you're painting. And all I'm really going to do is come in and paint in these areas which I've already sculpted just to emphasize them. And we can always hit X and set our background color to our base if we need an eraser. Because this is painting and there's no real layers in this system like there are in Photoshop or another image editing program. There's not really layers in texture painting in Blender, so you can't really erase per se. But what you can do is set your background color to, you know, your base color, and then press X to switch back and forth if you need to go in and like reduce, like if I wanted to reduce the thickness of this dark stroke, you'd press X and come in and just paint over it again with my background color. Okay, so I'm just going to do that for all the areas that I have sculpted sort of crevices into. And I'm not going to do any sort of symmetry in this painting because although symmetry does save us a lot of time early on in modeling and in sculpting, I find that when doing textures, it actually decreases the quality, so to speak, because things are not naturally symmetrical in life, and when they are perfectly symmetrical, it tends to stand out to the eye. So having sort of asymmetrical surface detail in paint tends to make pieces look better. Even if you're not going for realism per se, it still looks unnatural to have something be perfectly symmetrical. pressing Shift and F there to get the strength up, or the strength option up, and then reducing it even further just for some of these wider crevices. They shouldn't be quite as dark as some of these tighter ones. And what I also want to do is start sort of blending these out. Because right now you can kind of see every single stroke that I'm making because the difference between these two colors is so great. What we can do here is just start adjusting this color until it's a little bit closer to our base color, but not exactly the same. And we have sort of a mid-ground color here. So as I move out away from the creases, I can start using the mid-ground color to sort of blend it into the base. I think I'm going to desaturate this even farther. Typically, the more saturated your colors are, the more they pop out and forward. So if you're painting into these crevices and it's just not really the look you want to achieve because it's too, it looks like it's standing out too much, try desaturating your dark colors, your shadow colors, and see if that helps. So like, let's save this one and let's get rid of this more saturated one because I think I want it to be something closer to that. I also think I want to go in and give this some overall color variation before I get too far into painting these details. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, from my base color here, I'm going to come in, I'm just going to make some changes. I'm going to make it more gray and just sort of shift the hue slightly here to a more light gray, and I'm just going to come in and over the whole thing just do a little bit of modeling like we did with our tile set here. And this may be easier to do on the 2D side. It's totally up to you. I tend to like to paint on the actual 3D model. And I'm just kind of randomly tapping on this at different pen pressures and different angles and strokes just to get some natural variation in the stone color itself. So if you are using the material preview shader and coming around and you come around to the back of your model and it's a little too dark for you to be able to see what you're doing, you can rotate the light that is shining on your model by coming up to the drop down here, and here where it says rotation, if we just slide this around, you can see it'll shift the light more towards the back. Unfortunately, there's no real way to do this with the bottom because the axis for rotation for the material preview anyway is based on the z-axis, so it'll rotate around your object this way, but you can't really rotate it this way. So if you really need to see the bottom, your best bet is to actually add a light into your scene by coming in here, adding a light. A point light is fine, and then placing it under your model. You'll see right now this is not appearing to do anything because we are still in material preview, which uses sort of these preset lights. But if you switch to rendered view here, you can see that this light is now having an effect, and you can come in and paint on your model. And if this sort of viewport noisiness when you move around is bothering you, we can get rid of that for the time being by changing our render engine back from cycles to Eevee. We don't need the cycles engine anymore. We've already baked all our maps and saved them out. So if you change it back to Eevee, which is the real-time renderer, now when you move things around, you won't get that sort of fuzziness in your viewport. I'm going to delete this because I am just going to eyeball it. And let's return to texture paint here. And make sure that we change our mode back to texture paint as well to get our brush back. Okay, so we're almost done adding some variation. I'm probably going to do maybe 1 or 2 more layers of just random variation here. Okay, let's do one that's maybe a little bit darker. Coming into the color and reducing it, and maybe adding ever so slightly adding some blue by pushing our dot towards the blue end of the color spectrum. Let's see how that looks. Yeah, I think if we keep our pressure really light here, and as long as we go over this uniformly, I think this will be fine. Plus, I want to add some more cool colors such as blues and more blue grays to this piece, because if you recall, our tile set piece, our walls and our floors and our ceilings have this similar brown color that we have right now. And I think adding a brown piece into a largely brown scene, we're not going to be able to see as much. We want this to pop out somewhat, so we're going to add some more cool colors to it. This might be a little bit too dark. Let's lighten it up a little bit. It's just the strokes that I'm adding are just standing out a little bit more than I would really like them to. I want this to be sort of a subtle effect. You know, it looks a little bit strange right now, but I'm hoping that once the entire thing is covered in sort of a uniform level of variation, that it won't appear quite so strange. And if we need to, we can come back and like areas such as this brow piece, which you can see in the 2D portion right here is like quite a strong stroke. I'm just going to come in with my base color and sort of knock that effect down so it's a little bit more subtle. There we go. That's slightly better. And if there's too much lag for your PC here when doing this texture painting, you can always try, instead of doing 4K textures, you can paint with 2K textures. You'll still get decent results, and the performance cost will be cut essentially in half. I'm going to rotate my lights around some more so I can see this side lit a little bit more brightly. gonna knock that stroke back a little bit. It's a little extreme. And so far, this is looking pretty good. I'm not going to spend as much time on this piece as I would if I were doing it for production. Obviously, you know, you can spend hours and hours and hours just getting your texture paint perfect or your sculpt perfect. But, you know, for the purposes of this video and demonstrating these techniques, I think you get the idea. You can also come in here and paint directly. If you notice any patches that you just for whatever reason are having trouble getting with the 3D paint, you can always come into the 2D side and get it right here. I'm just sort of randomly squiggling and scribbling over this to get some natural variation look. It looks like I missed this section, pretty significant portions of it anyway, with my lighter gray. So I'm going to come in with the lighter gray. And I'm just checking sort of everywhere on both the 3D model and the 2D model to make sure that it looks more or less uniform in my color variation. I'm going to do one more layer of variation, again in a warmer color. I'm going to choose something a little bit more in the red spectrum. So I'm going to start by coming from my base color. I'm going to push this ever so slightly towards red. I do want to leave it pretty desaturated because I don't want it to have like, I don't want it to stand out too much. And I think for this one, I think it's a little bit quicker if I just come over and do it on the 2D side. The issue you may run into with painting on your 2D side is that your strokes across seams will not be smooth. So like when I hit the edge of this, it's not automatically going to start painting on the top of the head. It's just going to have a hard stop. So for this type of work, I think it's okay because it should be more or less uniform variation, but for some of the more detailed like shadows and things like that we've been painting, I like to do it on the 3D to avoid any strangeness with the seams. Okay. So how you want to color this and what you choose is largely up to you. I'm looking at this and I still think it's a little too brown, and I want the whole thing overall to be just a little bit cooler. So I'm gonna select like a bluish gray, and I'm gonna keep my strength relatively low because I don't want to undo any of this variation. I just want to add a little bit to it. I just want to change the color a little bit. So I'm just going to come in with a fairly large stroke and just start changing the color here. So you can see it's shifted more towards the gray than it is towards the brown. I'm going to lose a little bit of detail in the shadow, but that's okay because I want to change the color of them anyway. And we want to make sure that when you're doing this, you're coming over the edges here again, because you don't want brown seams behind a more gray piece here. It also has the effect, coming over this like this, has the effect of sort of reducing the intensity of that color variation. So it's just a little bit more subtle. Okay, so I've changed the overall color. I'm just going to come in here and try to blend some of these seams in together a little bit better. It's not too bad though. Okay, so let's resume here with these shadows. I'm going to pick my shadow color, but I'm just going to push it a little bit towards blue so it's not so brown. Let's save that color. And let's light this properly. Okay, so now let's go around and continue doing our shadows. I'm just going to come really lightly over the areas I've already done to make sure that their colors are correct. So how saturated and how colorful you want your piece to be is largely up to you and the style that you're going for. However, one thing to note when you are doing textures for lighting in Unreal is that the most common mistake that is made when creating textures is to make them too dark. So this stone is much lighter than I want it to really appear in game. However, because of the way lighting works in Unreal, you typically will find that painting them a little bit lighter than the actual final result will give you the result you need. It is a very common beginner mistake to say, oh, I want something black, and just to paint it a solid black color. But the problem with that is that when you bring it into Unreal and try to light it in the engine, the light just won't have enough information to work off of, essentially, and you really won't be able to see your object. So you never really want to give anything a color with a value lower than like 0.2 is like the absolute lowest. That would be like a black. Because if you think about it, objects in nature, none of them really truly are black. Even black objects still reflect some amount of light. And because this is a digital environment, we kind of have to compensate for that effect by not painting our objects quite as dark as we want them to appear. So just keep that in mind. So what I'm doing here is I'm just going over the sculpted lines, but I'm going a little bit beyond these sculpted lines to add in a little even finer level of detail. So like, for instance, my normal map, the crevice right here around the nose stops about here, but I'm extending the paint over here just to emphasize it a little bit more. As long as you keep your paint colors pretty subtle, meaning that they don't, the hue and value difference between them doesn't vary too much, you can really do a lot of sort of faking texture and light with just color. Now, I'm sampling colors directly from my 3D model here because I've sort of layered many colors over each other, and I kind of want to get a medium blend between some of those layered colors to sort of correct some of these strokes here. So you can sample colors from images, but you can also sample them directly from your 3D model on areas that you've already painted. Alright, so I don't want to spend too much longer on the shadow portion. I'd like to wrap this video So I'm just going to finish out these lines really quickly. But obviously, for your own purposes, I do recommend you spend a lot more time than I'm spending on this and really get your painting down. And the more you practice your painting, the better you're going to get at it. So it's really worth it to spend the time on it. Because I'm recording this for purposes of demonstration, I'm not going to spend too much longer on this. I'm just going to get these major forms in. Okay, so I'm going to call it here on sort of the shadow pass of this painting. Obviously, it's a bit messy, and for your own piece, I do recommend you spend a lot longer getting the painting right. But I think you understand the idea of how to do this. So we're going to take a quick break, and we're going to come back in the next video and finish up a highlight pass, and then emphasize some of these sculpted details as well. So that will be in the next video. Okay, so we are about halfway done with our base color texture paint. So let's go across this, and we've already done our shadow pass, so let's go and do a highlighting pass. So if darker and cooler colors push areas away from the eye when viewing things, warmer, brighter colors will pull them forward. So when we're making a highlight, typically we want to go lighter, and we want to go a little bit warmer. And that will have the sort of desired effect. So I'm just going to come up with a fairly large brush size, but a very light stroke, and start painting over the raised areas of my mesh to emphasize them. And I might even go a little bit lighter. So just anywhere that the mesh comes out or forward, or that you want to really emphasize, just come in with like a sort of a light beigeish, if you're going for the same color scheme I am. Of course, if you're doing a green or a blue, you're gonna, you know, like if my whole thing was more blue, I would still want to do a lighter, warmer color, but I wouldn't have it this yellow, obviously. I would come in, and like if this was my base color, let's say, was like this sort of dark gray, I would still push it towards the red, but it would be like more of a purple, and then I would lighten it up. So it depends on where your base color is, but typically you want to go a little bit lighter and a little bit warmer for your highlights. And you always want to do, just a general rule of painting, you always want to do the shadow layer first and the highlight layer last. It just tends to work out better that way. You get a little bit cleaner, crisper lines, and your highlights will just pop more if you do them over the shadows versus the other way around. And if you're really pressed for time on this, you can enable symmetry painting for this. Now, this active tool space is going to be largely the same as it is for the sculpting. So you can enable it either here under symmetry or up here in the toolbar here. I'm going to leave it off because I think the results are better when you do not paint symmetrically. For the reasons I've already stated in the previous video, but if you are pressed for time, that is an option in texture painting as well as in sculpting. I'm just returning to my original base color here because this line ended up a little bit less tapered than I would like. I'm just going to blend that in. And of course, my base color is sort of an amalgamation of several colors, so you may have to go over something like that a couple times to really blend it properly. Trying to blend some of these strokes together. I'm not going to spend too much time on blending again because this is just a demonstration. I don't, want to spend too much time on stuff that is really just repetitive and probably should be done off camera, but I think it is good to see a little bit of how this blending is done. But I mean, at its most basic level, all you really have to do is sample a color between the two colors that you're trying to blend. Come over it with that secondary color. See, I have a little error right here. I'm just gonna try to blend that out. Okay. For the helmet or the hat, I think the way that I'm going to go about this is to just blend these upper and lower corner or edges right next to the shadow parts and leave the bulk of this as the base color. So it's really just the same thing all the way around. You're just going to come up to the raised areas, give them a little highlight. When you add highlights pretty close into your shadows, it just adds a little bit of extra detail and contrast, and it makes those creases pop just a little bit more. Unfortunately, I'm getting a little bit of error because I'm getting some lag painting on a 4K texture and trying to record at the same time is pretty taxing on my machine. So every once in a while I'll get sort of these little hiccups and it'll end up with like a dot like that. If you can, Control Z to undo it, that's obviously the best way to get rid of it, but if not, you'll just have to come in with something closer to the base color and blend it out. So I do find that blending with just using the regular brush and changing your colors does work the best. However, Blender does have some blending functionalities, as you may guess, we have a soften and a smear brush up here. So far, we've only been using the draw brush to paint normally on our mesh. However, we can soften some of these lines. If I come up here with, it's a little bit hard to see because my colors are so similar, but if I come up here with a soften brush, I have the strength of 1, I can just come over the edges of this and it will reduce the contrast just a little bit by sort of smearing these out. So it's maybe worth your time to come over if you have these sort of harsher lines like I have, and come and blend these in. Again, I tend to find that just blending them with color gives a better result, but this definitely gets you headed in the right direction. So you can see that my computer is starting to lag a little bit. I'm gonna do a little bit of blending off camera, and then we're gonna come back and we're going to go over how to emphasize some of this stone texture. Okay, so I've done a little bit more highlighting and blending off camera, not an extreme amount, and obviously if this was for production, I'd probably spend a lot more time on this section before moving on. But for the purposes of this demonstration, I think you get the idea. Let's go ahead and save our image before we do anything else, because we're going to move on to using the AO mask to emphasize some of these little crevices and stone surface details. And that is also very taxing on your machine, and should Blender crash because you have a memory overload, you don't want to lose all the work that you've done up to this point. So save it right now before you forget, and let's bring in our ambient occlusion mask. So we did this for the tiling texture portion, and it's really going to be the same process here. So I'm just going to come into masking and enable my stencil mask. And under my stencil mask, I'm just going to select my ambient occlusion here. Now, the display color will display it as black. Anything in the black area is not going to be affected. If this is distracting to you, you can change the display color to something like white. This display color will not affect what is being affected by the mask at all. I like to just come in here and visualize it here in my image editor. I think it just gives me a clearer idea of what's happening rather than having to deal with this display color. Okay, so let's set our paint color to something quite dark, like a 0.2. It's pretty much as dark as you want to go. And now we're just going to come in. I'm going to be looking at it here to get a better idea of what's going on, because I find it somewhat hard to see. And I'm going to keep my brush size pretty small here, because again, the larger your brush size, the more pixels you're trying to affect per stroke, the slower this process will go. So I'm just going to do a couple strokes to show you, in case maybe you skipped the section or you are watching these out of order. We're just going to look at, I'm going to increase my strength here maybe to 1. So as I paint here, you can see the detail that's being added in the corners is following that stone surface sculpting. So most of your model should not be affected when you paint over with the mask. It should really only be the deepest crevices. And if for whatever reason you're getting the inverse of this, meaning that most of your model is being painted and the crevices are not, that just means you need to flip your ambient occlusion mask. Again, if you baked everything correctly, this should not be an issue. But if for whatever reason, or if you're just working on a different model and you do need to flip your AO map, all you have to do is next to where it says display color, we have this icon here, which says invert. So that will invert your mask so that when you paint on it, now it is painting all the raised surfaces and the dark surfaces are not being affected. So I'm going to de-flip that basically, and I'm just going to paint over my mesh. I'm going to paint over the whole thing, but I'm going to pay the most attention to the face. Again, because that is the area that we will probably be looking at the most when we view this in game. I also find that for this portion of the painting process, I typically use my mouse and not my tablet pen, because even with a strength set to 1, as long as you have this icon enabled, it's going to vary your strength based on your pressure, and typically you're never going to get a pen pressure of 1. So you can either disable this or just use the mouse for this portion, because like a mouse click has no pressure sensitivity, so it always just defaults to the strength of 1. So you can see all this little speckling that it's adding as I move around the sides of this piece. It's a pretty subtle effect, like when you look at the map overall, but I do think it's worth doing it. It just makes sure that all that work you put into the sculpt really gets seen. Make sure we get the bottom, because of course we will be seeing the bottom of these as well. Okay, let's see how that looks by unchecking stencil mask, and that gives us our final result. So it's a subtle difference, but it just adds a lot to these little cracks and stone texture surfaces here. So that is going to conclude our texture painting portion for this piece. In the next video, we are going to be bringing this into Unreal and getting it set up in our blueprint. Okay, so we have just finished our base color paint here. I'm going to make sure that we save this image. And now let's look at bringing this into Unreal. So the first thing I want to look at, just like we did with the tile set, is we need to make sure we know where the pivot point for this piece should be. So let's go ahead and open our Unreal project. Okay, so here is where we left off in our project. We had made our tile sets and replaced all our walls and floors and ceilings. I have not personally made a different texture for the columns here, but once we get the prop in, essentially the process is going to be the same as it was for this and for the prop, for however you want to make any piece. So let's look. So our mesh pieces we just made are going to be replacing these blocks here. So I'm just going to pull this one out from the wall a little bit to look at it. Okay, so it appears as though we have our pivot right at the corner, the bottom corner of our piece here. So how you want the final mesh pieces to be oriented is entirely up to you. Obviously, these placeholder cubes, they're the same on every side, so it doesn't really matter which way they're pointing. But whether or not you want the faces facing out this way so that when you walk into the room you see them, or if you want them facing this way on this face so that, you know, as you're running through them you're seeing the faces, that's totally up to you, and you can, you know, try a variety of different orientations and see what works best for you. But what we need to note here is that the pivot is in the bottom corner. So we need to match that in Blender here. So currently our pivot is right at the brow, which is not going to work. So let's move this around a little. So I'm just going to come into front orthographic by pressing 1 on my keyboard, and I'm going to tab into edit mode. Now remember, if we move something in edit mode, it will leave the pivot where it is relative to the world, so we can effectively move the pivot by moving the mesh relative to it. So make sure everything is selected by pressing A on your keyboard for all, and let's leave snapping on for the moment, but instead of having it on face, which we had for our retopology section, let's make sure we change it back to increment. Otherwise it will not snap correctly. So because this is a rounded piece, the pivot is going to be slightly more approximate, but that is okay. So I'm just going to press G and Z to bring it up until it is approximately resting on the ground. Again, this is a more organic form, so you're never going to have like these exact lines like we were having with our wall pieces, but that's okay. So it's a little bit in front. If we come to the top view by pressing 7 on our keyboard, I want to shift it over in the X direction, so I'm just going to press G and X and move it to about here. This may be a little bit off, so let's try to bring it in so that like this area is more in the center. So I'm going to press Control and 7 to bring up the bottom view, and I'm just going to push it into about there. So I think that should approximately work. Again, because this is sort of a unique prop, and we're only using it in this one instance so far, it's not going to be too hard to adjust. I just don't want them to be wildly mismatched when I bring it in. Okay, so we have our pivot set. Let's make sure our rotations are zeroed out by hitting N to pull up this side panel. So we see we have our scale is a little bit off here, as is our rotation. So let's just apply all these transformations by pressing Control and A on the keyboard and select all for all transformations. So that should 0 these out and 1 these out. Okay, let's just press save. If you haven't saved recently, make sure to save your work a lot. Okay, so now that we are all set, we have our transforms, we have our pivots. Let's go ahead and export this. So I'm just going to make sure that this piece is selected. File, Export, FBX. Choose a location on your machine and make sure that we have selected objects enabled. I basically have this as a preset in some earlier versions of Blender, so you can save your export options at any time in Blender for reuse. So if I, made some changes here and said, okay, this is how I want to export every time for Unreal, well, I could set that as a preset by pressing this plus key and naming my preset. Let's name it Unreal. Okay, so now every time I choose this from the operator presets dropdown, it will automatically make any changes that I made here. In this case, it's just to highlight my selected objects. But if you had a more specific export settings, you could save them for reuse. Okay, so let's give this a name. I'm going to call it SM for static mesh, and then we're going to call it Olmec head because that's what it is, and we're going to export. All right, back in Unreal, let's go into our mesh folder where we have all our finalized mesh pieces, and let's import that file we just created. We want to make sure that these material settings, import settings are set correctly. These have retained my last import settings, so I just want to make sure that in case anything got messed up, that these are correct. We do not want to import textures with the material, and we do not want to create a material. We're going to do that all ourselves, so let's import. Don't worry too much about the smoothing group information unless you're seeing some errors. Okay, so here is our mesh with no materials applied to it. So up until now, we've just been using the same material for everything. So if I were to apply this material, you can see obviously this is not going to work. So let's bring in our new materials, or I should say our new textures that we have saved to our hard drive. So in my textures folder, I'm just going to come and import. I'm going to select these 3 pieces right here that I've made and import these in. Okay, so this is where things get a little interesting. You might think that I want to go in and create a new material and just assign all those pieces, and you could do that, but that is actually not really optimal for performance in Unreal. Unreal performs much better if you use what is called material instances. So just as all these different mesh pieces in my level are instances of single mesh pieces, we can basically do the same thing with our materials to save on some performance. So I'm going to make an instance of this wall material and basically change some settings so that it displays different textures. So in order for this to work properly, there's some things we need to edit about this material, but let me just show you what would happen if I were to create an instance of this right now. So to create a material instance, all you have to do is click on a regular master material, such as this one, and hit and right click and choose create material instance. So you can give it whatever name you like. We're going to make this eventually our Olmec material, so let's just make it that. Now you'll notice that the bar at the bottom here is a dark green and the one on the master is the light green. This is just to tell you that it is a material instance and not a master material. So when you hover over them as well, you'll see that next to the name it says that this one is a material and this one is a material instance. Now we have actually worked with material instances before, we just didn't get into the details of them. So all of our grid prototypes here were instances of a master grid material that came with our template. So let's get into a little bit more how this works by opening up our Olmec material instance. So right now we don't have any changeable settings here. All we have is the parent instance that this is coming from. And we can't really change anything about this. That is because we need to go into this master material here and tell it what values are going to be variables. And you should remember variables from our blueprints scripting section, but we can use variables in materials as well as in coding. So if we double click and open up our master material, we of course get this graph here. So all I need to do to make this work as a material instance is tell it what parts of this I need to be variable. And in materials in Unreal, variables are actually called parameters. But essentially they function, theoretically under the same circumstances. So I have this texture here for my wall base color here. But for this material instance, I need to be able to switch out all these textures, essentially. So to change these such that I can switch them out under the instance, all I have to do is in the master material, right click on the texture sample and say convert to parameter. Now this will hiccup a little bit, but it will keep the original texture you had, but now we can name it something. So let's name this one base color. And let's do the same with these two. Convert to parameter. Let's call this one AO. And convert to parameter and call this one normal. So let's save this out. And now when I come into my material instance here, you can see I have these parameters here that I can change. So all I have to do is enable the override by clicking these checkboxes here. And now what I can do is come into this drop down and select whatever texture I want to replace this texture with. So I can also do it from the content browser if that is faster for you. All I have to do is click and drag. Click and drag, click and drag. And you can see it instantly updates here in the preview. And you may notice that it's updating much faster than it would if you were trying to make this a new master material. So not only are material instances faster to calculate, We also now don't have to redo all this information for the roughness. It's basically using this same exact setup. It's just replacing these inputs with whatever we tell it to right here. So now we can come into our mesh itself, and instead of using this master material, let's drag in our new material, and you can see right here how that works. So that is looking pretty good. Let's save it out. So the last thing we need to do to get this working is to replace these static meshes with our new mesh here. So the way that I'm going to do this is by coming into my blueprints folder, opening up my blueprint, and I'm going to come into the viewport so I can see this change happen. And basically I'm going to just select this static mesh piece, and I don't have to do really much to it. All I have to do is come over here to the details panel, and where it says static mesh, instead of having the cube selected, well, we're just going to drop in our new Olmec head piece. So we did get a little bit of error with the location of it, but that's not really a problem. We also have an error with the size because our original cube piece was too small, so we doubled the size. So because we just replaced this static mesh, it retained that doubled information. So let's reset the size here. And actually, I want this box to not be attached so that I can move this one independently, because if I were to leave this attached, when I try to move the static mesh, it moves the collision box with it, which we do not want. So let's detach this box by just clicking and dragging it up onto the static mesh, and it says drop here to detach. So let's do that. And now I can move this piece independently and scale it independently. So this should be the right size, but we can always check by coming into our level here. And those look pretty good. They're a little bit off. I'm going to fix that. We can fix it directly in here and re-export and import it, or since we are only using it really in this one place, let's just set the scale to 1.5 in the blueprint editor and position this properly. And there we go. Okay, so the last step here would be to just test these out to make sure that they still work with our gameplay functionality. So let's click over here, right click, play from here, and let's make sure these work properly. And they do. So that is how you go about making unique props and replacing your prototype props in Engine.